$3. That's what they paid for her. Less than a broken horse. Less than a week's worth of whiskey. 19-year-old Abigail Halloway stood on that auction block, her wrists bound with rope sold like livestock to pay her dead father's gambling debts. The man who bought her? A bounty hunter with a scar across his face and eyes as cold as a winter grave. But here's what nobody expected. Not the cruel crime lord who wanted to break her. Not the killers hunting them through frozen mountain passes. Not even the man who paid $3 for her life. That helpless girl would become the one doing the saving, and the monster who thought he owned her? He never saw her coming. This story proves that you can put a price tag on a person, but you can never, ever own their spirit. Because sometimes the woman they underestimate the most becomes the one who burns their whole empire to the ground. If you love stories where the hunted becomes the hunter, drop a comment below. And if you want to see how a $3 bride rewrote the history of the American West, hit subscribe. This one will keep you up all night. It was October 18th, 1874, in the Wyoming Territory, a town called Purgatory Creek. The Gilded Horn Saloon was filled with the smell of old beer, dirty men, and pure hopelessness. That heavy air felt like it was choking Abigail Halloway. She was standing on top of a wooden crate, her wrists tied together with a coarse rope that scraped her skin raw. At only 19 years old, she was the daughter of a schoolteacher who had passed from sickness 2 winters before, and a father who had bet away everything they had right before taking his own life just last Tuesday. Selling his daughter was his final act. Abigail was being auctioned to settle his debts with Cyrus Blackwood, the most powerful and ruthless man in town. The auctioneer, a greasy fellow named Jedediah Crump, sneered as he grabbed Abigail's face with his filthy hand. "Take a look at her, gentlemen." Abigail flinched away, but the ropes held her in place. She has good teeth, strong hips for childbearing, and her father swore she was untouched before he died. "Who will start the bidding at $50? Abigail stared down at the wooden floor. She started counting the little knots in the wood to keep from crying. 1, 2, 3... 20, shouted a young fella from the mines near the front, his face covered in soot. 25, called out a man in a velvet suit, likely a card sharp from down around Cheyenne. Abigail's heart was beating against her ribs like a wild animal in a cage. She knew full well what happened to women who were bought and sold like this. They were not treated like wives, they were treated like property. $40, a voice boomed from across the saloon. It was Cyrus Blackwood himself. He was sitting at a poker table, swirling amber whiskey in a glass, a cruel grin spreading across his face. He was not looking for a bride. He wanted to break the daughter of a man who owed him a debt. To him, this was all a game. The whole room went quiet as a tomb. In a town like Purgatory Creek, you did not cross Blackwood. "Going once at 40, Jedediah," the auctioneer said, raising his wooden hammer. $3. The voice was low and gritty, and it cut through that heavy silence like a shard of glass. It came from the deepest shadows in the back corner of the room. The crowd started to whisper amongst themselves. Blackwood just laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. $3? Are you trying to insult me, stranger? Why, the girl is worth at least 50 in work alone. A chair screeched on the floorboards. A man stood up. He was a giant, standing an easy 6'3", wearing a long duster coat that had been black once, but was now faded to the gray color of a long, dusty road. Dust. His hat was pulled down low, hiding his eyes, but you could see the dark stubble on his jaw. He walked slowly into the light, and the spurs on his boots made a heavy, rhythmic sound. Clink, step, clink, step. He came to a halt right in front of Blackwood's table. $3, the stranger said again. He did not raise his voice because he did not need to. And the debt note her father signed. Blackwood's smile disappeared. "Who in the world are you?" "Elias Graham." The name landed in the room with the force of a punch. All the whispering stopped at once. Even the man playing the piano froze. Elias Graham was the bounty hunter of the Badlands. He was the man who hunted down the butcher of Abilene through 3 different states and returned him in a burlap sack. Graham reached inside his duster. A few men nervously went for their pistols, but he just pulled out 3 big silver dollars and threw them down on Blackwood's table. Next, he slammed a sheet of paper down beside them. It was an official bounty warrant. "Your brother, Thomas Blackwood," Elias said in a calm voice. "He was wanted for robbing a bank in Omaha. I caught him. I delivered him to the law. The reward money clears the girl's debt with an extra $3 for the trouble of having to stand in this stinking place." Blackwood's face turned a deep shade of red. He jumped to his feet, his hand hovering over his gun. "Do you really think you can just come in here and buy my property for spare change?" "She is not property, Cyrus," Elias said, his voice becoming deeper and colder. His own hand did not move toward his weapon. It just hung at his side, looking dangerously calm. "She is a citizen, and unless you want the United States Marshals investigating why you are selling women in a territory that wants to become a state, you will accept the $3. Blackwood glanced around the saloon. He could see the fear in every man's face. He could see the famous Colt Peacemaker pistol resting on Elias's hip. He spat on the floor right beside the silver dollars. "Take her," Blackwood hissed through his teeth. "She looks too skinny anyway. She probably will not survive the winter." Elias did not bother to reply. He walked over to the crate, tossed the 3 coins to the shocked auctioneer, and then pulled a sharp knife from his belt. Abigail shut her eyes tightly, bracing for a sharp pain, but instead she felt the ropes around her wrists suddenly go loose and fall away. "Walk," Elias said. It was not a question. He turned around and walked out of the saloon, letting the swinging doors slam behind him. Abigail, rubbing her sore wrists, quickly climbed down from the crate and hurried to follow him, her worn-out leather shoes slipping on the sawdust-covered floor. She had just been purchased for $3 by a known killer, and she had no idea if she had just been rescued or if she was now in even worse danger. Outside, a fierce wind was blowing, creating small whirlwinds of dust that spun down the middle of the main street. Elias Graham was already getting on a huge black horse, an animal that looked just as fierce as the man who owned him. He looked down at Abigail, who stood there shivering in her simple cotton dress. "You will ride behind me," he said, holding out a hand to her. It was a large, calloused hand with scars running over the knuckles. Abigail did not move. Where are we going?" she asked. "Away from Blackwood," was his only answer. He lifted her onto the horse with surprising strength, setting her on its back just behind his saddle. "Hold on to the saddle leather, not to me," he commanded. They left Purgatory Creek without another word, the sound of the horse's hooves like thunder on the hard ground. The town slowly disappeared behind them, and soon they were surrounded by the huge, frightening emptiness of the Wyoming wilderness. The land was harsh, full of sharp rocks, thorny bushes, and a sky that was so enormous it could make a person feel very small. They rode for 3 hours and never spoke. Abigail's legs began to ache, and the cold wind cut right through her dress, making her skin break out in goosebumps. She could only stare at the back of Elias's coat. It smelled like tobacco, horse sweat, and gun oil. Who was this man really? Why did he step in to help her? The stories people told about Elias Graham were terrifying. They said he did not have a heart, that he had carved it out of his own chest so he could be a better killer. They said he lived all by himself up in the mountains because normal people could not bear to even look at him. As the sun started to sink below the horizon, it painted the sky with harsh colors of deep purple and blood orange. Elias turned the horse away from the main path and onto a narrow, rocky trail that led up into the mountains. "Please," Abigail whispered, her voice weak from the dust. "Are you planning to kill me?" Elias did not look back. "If I wanted you dead, girl, I would have just let Blackwood buy you." "Then what is it that you want? I do not know how to be a proper wife. I can cook a little bit, and I know how to read, but—" "Be quiet," he said sharply. But his voice did not sound angry, just very tired. They finally arrived at a small cabin that was built under the shade of a large granite cliff. It was a hidden and well-protected place, tough and rugged, just like him. There was a pen for the horse, and a little stream flowing nearby. It was not a home. It was a hideout. Elias got off his horse and then helped her down. His hands stayed on her waist for just a moment, longer than they needed to, but not in a creepy way. It was more as if he was checking to see how fragile she was. He gestured toward the cabin door. "There is firewood inside," he said. "Light it." Abigail rushed inside. The cabin was very simple, with only a small bed, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove. She located the matches and lit the kindling inside the stove. Her hands were shaking so much that she broke the first 2 matches. By the time she had a small fire going, Elias came in. He was carrying his saddlebags and his rifle. He kicked the door closed behind him and slid a heavy wooden bar across it. The feeling in the small room changed immediately. The wide-open space outside was gone, replaced by a close and almost suffocating feeling. It was now just the 2 of them, the innocent young woman and the dangerous bounty hunter. Elias removed his hat and threw it onto the table. For the very first time, Abigail could see his face clearly in the glow of the fire. He was younger than she had guessed, maybe 32 years old, but his eyes looked ancient. They were the color of gray steel, cold and hard. A long white scar cut a jagged line from his left temple, all the way back into his hair. He was handsome, but in a frightening and rugged kind of way. He just stood there and stared at her. His intense gaze moved from her messy brown hair all the way down to her old shoes. He took a single step in her direction. Abigail moved backward until her back was pressed against the rough wooden wall. "Mr. Graham, "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to one of the chairs. She sat, and her knees began to tremble. Elias let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to come from deep inside his chest. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small, folded pocket knife. He flicked it open with one thumb. The steel blade shined in the orange firelight. Abigail's breathing stopped. "This is it," she thought. "He is a madman. He is going to cut me, mark me like an animal." He started walking toward her, his spurs clinking on the floor. Clink, step. He stopped when he was standing directly in front of her. He seemed to tower over her small body. Then, very slowly and with great purpose, Elias Graham began to lower himself. He went all the way down onto one knee. Abigail's eyes grew wide with confusion. Was he making a proposal? Was he mocking her? He reached out with his left hand and took a firm hold of her ankle. Abigail looked down. She saw the open knife in his right hand as it moved closer to her leg. She saw the sharp focus in his eyes. And then she noticed something else. As the sleeve of his shirt slid up his arm, she saw a brand that had been burned into his skin. It was not the brand of a cattle ranch. It was a strange symbol, a circle with a cross running through it. She knew that symbol. She had seen it one other time in her life. Carved into the handle of the pistol that her father had used on himself. A pure, cold dread washed right over her. This man was not a savior. He was just another part of the debt. He was the Reaper. Elias brought that blade closer to her skin. Abigail opened her mouth and let out a scream. It was a blood-curdling sound that rattled the log walls. A scream of pure, raw panic. "No, do not touch me," she shrieked, kicking out with all her might. Her boot caught him square in the shoulder, knocking him off balance. Elias let out a roar. "Hold still, dang it! You killed him," she screamed, scrambling backward and knocking over a chair. "You are one of them. The dead circle." Elias froze right there on one knee, the knife just hanging in the air. The anger on his face melted away into pure shock. "What in blazes did you just say?" "The brand on your arm." Abigail pointed, her finger shaking like a leaf. "My father. He warned me about men with that mark. You did not buy me to save me. You bought me to finish the job." Elias looked down at his arm. Then his eyes went back to Abigail. The silence in the room grew heavy and dangerous. He slowly folded the knife and got to his feet. "You think I am with the circle?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I saw the mark. Elias started to unbutton his shirt. Abigail pressed herself into the corner, covering her eyes. Please, no. Look at me, he commanded. Abigail dared to peek through her fingers. Elias had pulled his shirt open. His chest was a tangled map of angry scars from bullets, blades, and even animal claws. But right there over his heart was another tattoo. It was that same circle and cross, but someone had taken a knife to it, carving a deep, ragged X right through it, a raw scar of pure rejection. I was with them, Elias said, his voice low and gritty like grinding stones. 10 years ago, before I knew what they truly were. Now, he pointed to the scar over his heart. Now I hunt them. And that brand on your father's gun? That did not mean he was one of them, Abigail. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with intensity. It meant he stole from them. And that makes you the last loose end they need to tie up. Abigail lowered her hands, the fear in her eyes slowly giving way to confusion. What? What were you going to do with that knife? Elias glanced at the pocket knife, then motioned to the bottom of her dress. There is a tracking beacon sewn into your hem, a little silver thread. Blackwood put it there. I was trying to cut it out before his men could find this cabin. And right on cue, a sharp sound echoed off the canyon walls outside. That was not the wind. It was the crack of a rifle. A bullet tore through the cabin window, shattering the lantern on the table and throwing the room into complete darkness. The darkness inside the cabin was total, except for the moonlight cutting through the new hole in the window and the last glowing embers spilling from the knocked-over stove. The smell of kerosene from the broken lantern filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of sudden fear. Abigail did not even have time to scream again. Before the sound of that first shot even died out, Elias moved like lightning. He crossed the room in a single bound, his big hand clamping firm over her mouth to keep her quiet. With his other arm, he swept her clean off her feet, pulling her out of the middle of the room, just as a second bullet punched right through the thick oak door, sending wood splinters flying like shrapnel. He shoved her down behind the heavy cast-iron stove. It was cold, but it was solid enough to stop a bullet. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice a low rumble right next to her ear. "Do not move a muscle unless this whole cabin is on fire. Do you understand me?" In the dark, Abigail nodded hard, her heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to break free. Elias was gone in a flash, just disappearing into the shadows. She heard the sharp shuck-clack of a lever-action rifle being loaded. He slid over to the left of the door, his back flat against the logs, and peered through a little chink in the wall. Outside, voices carried on the wind. "We know you're in there. Graham Blackwood wants the girl. Give her up, and we might just make your death a quick one." It was the voice of the pimp in the velvet suit from the saloon, a fella named Beauregard, the kind of coward who pays other men to do his dirty work. Elias said nothing. He just waited. He was like a statue made of shadow and patience. Another round of shots ripped into the cabin. The rest of the window glass exploded. Tin plates rattled off the shelves and hit the floor. Abigail curled up tight, her hands clamped over her ears, praying to a god she was not sure paid much mind to folks in the Wyoming territory these days. Then Elias moved. He stepped in front of the broken window for just a split second. The muzzle flash of his Winchester lit up the room like a bolt of lightning. Crack! Crack! 2 shots fired as fast as you could blink. Outside, a man let out a wet, gurgling scream that cut off real sudden. Then nothing. "That is one of Blackwood's fancy hired guns down," Elias muttered under his breath, working the rifle's lever again. 3 left, if I'm counting right. He crawled low to the floor, making his way back to Abigail. She flinched when he got close, but his hand on her ankle was gentler this time. "The knife," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You still have the knife." "I need the hem of your dress, Abigail," he whispered. Urgently, his eyes darting toward the windows. They found us way too fast. That tracker is still putting out a signal. If they do not finish us tonight, they will just track us down tomorrow. Abigail only hesitated for a second. The sound of bullets tearing through the walls was a whole lot scarier than the man next to her. She gathered up the heavy cotton skirt of her simple wedding dress, the last thing her father ever bought her, and pushed the hem toward him. Elias worked by feel in the dark. His thick fingers were surprisingly nimble. He found the stiff little ridge in the cloth. He was not gentle with it. He sliced the hem open with one quick pull of the blade. He dug his thumb in and popped out a tiny metal disc no bigger than a fingernail. Fancy gadgetry for the frontier, Elias growled. Blackwood has got expensive friends back east. He crawled to the fireplace, flicked the disc into the hot embers, and kicked some ash over it. A second later, there was a tiny muffled pop and a flash of strange green light that vanished as quick as it came. Now they are blind, Elias said, and that is just going to make them desperate. As if proving his point, something heavy thumped against the roof of the cabin. A second later, the smell of burning pitch drifted down. "Fire arrows," Elias cursed. "They are trying to burn us out." Things went from bad to worse in the blink of an eye. The cabin logs were dry as tinder. The roof was just thatch and dirt. It was going to go up like a torch. "We have to move," Elias said, pulling Abigail to her feet. He shoved his Colt Peacemaker into her shaking hands. The metal felt heavy and cold. "Do you know how to use this?" "I have shot rabbits with a varmint rifle, but point it at anything that is not me and pull the trigger until it clicks. Come on." He kicked the bar off the back door, a smaller exit that faced the cliff and led toward the horse corral. He threw it open. The night air rushed in, feeding the fire that was already chewing on the roof above. "Run for the horse," Elias commanded, shoving her out into the dark. "I will cover you." Abigail stumbled into the cold wind. The huge black stallion, Brimstone, was rearing up in the corral, spooked by the fire and all the noise. Behind her, Elias filled the doorway and let loose with his rifle, sending a hail of bullets toward the front of the cabin to keep the attackers down. Crack, crack, crack. Abigail reached the corral fence, her breath catching in her throat. She fumbled with the wooden latch. A bullet kicked up a spray of dirt just inches from her boots. She cried out and dropped the heavy revolver. "Leave it! Get on the horse!" Elias roared, sprinting right for her as the cabin roof started to cave in, sending down a rain of fire. He vaulted the fence in one move, grabbed Brimstone's halter, and calmed the spooked animal just long enough to grab Abigail by the waist and heave her up into the saddle. He swung up right behind her, the saddle leather groaning under their combined weight. "Hang on." Elias kicked the stallion hard. Brimstone lunged forward, smashing right through the weak corral gate. They rode hard into the darkness, away from the burning cabin that lit up the night like a warning beacon against the black cliffs. Behind them, the shouts and useless gunshots faded away as the other men scrambled to get clear of the fire or find their own horses. They did not stop. Elias rode like a man possessed, guiding the horse down dangerous rocky trails using nothing but the moonlight. Abigail buried her face in the rough wool of his coat, her arms wrapped tight around his middle, the smell of smoke and pure fear clinging to both of them. They were alive, but they had no shelter, and the wilderness out here was a big, unforgiving place. They rode for a solid 2 hours, putting mile after mile of twisted canyons between themselves and Purgatory Creek. Elias doubled back on their trail twice, rode them through a shallow creek for a mile to hide their scent, and finally took them up a steep, hidden trail that led to a high plateau. The adrenaline that had kept Abigail going started to wear off, and she began to shake something fierce. The cold mountain air cut right through her thin dress, and her teeth were chattering so hard her jaw ached. Elias seemed to sense her strength giving out. He slowed Brimstone down to a walk as they came upon a thick patch of aspen and pine trees up against a rock wall. "Here," he mumbled, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We will stop here." He slid off the horse first, landing hard on the ground. He stumbled just a bit when his boots hit the earth. A sharp hiss of pain came through his clenched teeth. Abigail nearly fell off the horse, her own legs as numb as wood. Are they still following? Not tonight. They lost that tracker signal and they would break their necks trying to follow this trail in the dark. We are safe for a few hours. He led the horse into the dense brush, securing the reins to a young sapling. The shadows were deeper in there, and while it offered a break from the wind, the cold was still biting. He told her to find wood, the small, dry kind from the forest floor. They needed a fire that was low to the ground and did not make much smoke. Abigail did as she was told, her mind numb. Her hands felt raw, but the desire for warmth was a powerful instinct. As she gathered a small pile of twigs and pine needles, Elias took the saddle off the horse. He placed the thick saddle blanket on the ground under the shelter of a rock ledge. He struck a match, using his body to shield the small flame until the kindling caught fire. That tiny point of orange light was the finest thing Abigail thought she had ever laid eyes on. As the fire grew stronger, it threw dancing shadows up against the rock. Abigail glanced at Elias through the flames. He had taken off his thick duster coat and sat with his back to the stone. His shirt was pulled up on his left side. He was holding a piece of cloth firmly against his ribs. The fabric was dark, completely soaked through with blood. Abigail let out a small gasp and brought her hands to her mouth. "You've been shot!" Elias winced, trying to see the wound for himself. "It's just a graze. One of Bose's boys got a lucky shot in while we were getting on the horses. Took a little skin off my side." "Let me see it." The words came out before she had a chance to think. He looked over at her, taken aback by the command in her voice. She moved around the small fire and knelt down next to him. Being this close, the metallic and sharp scent of new blood mixed with the smell of his sweat. He allowed her to gently move his hand away from the wound. It was a nasty gash that ran along his lower ribs. It was not deep enough to have struck anything vital, but it was jagged and bleeding a great deal. "That needs to be cleaned," she declared, her voice sounding more certain than her hands felt. "Do you have any whiskey in your saddlebags and a clean shirt?" Elias motioned with his head toward the bags he had set down. Abigail found a flask and a spare flannel shirt. She poured some of the amber-colored liquor onto a piece of the torn shirt. "This is going to sting," she warned him. Elias gave a dry laugh. "I have felt worse, girl. Go on and do it." She pressed the cloth soaked in alcohol against the injury. Elias's whole body went rigid. He clenched his jaw so hard that a muscle twitched in his cheek, and a quiet groan escaped his lips. But he did not move away. Abigail worked with purpose, cleaning the dirt out of the wound. She then wrapped his chest tightly with strips she tore from the flannel shirt to stop the flow of blood. For 10 minutes, neither of them spoke, caught in a peculiar closeness brought on by the need to survive. The fearsome bounty hunter was hurt, and the innocent bride was tending to his wounds. When she had finished, she sat back, wiping the sweat from her brow, which left a streak of his blood on her skin. Elias glanced down at the bandage and then looked up at her. The hard, frightening expression in his gray eyes had softened to something more thoughtful. "You have steady hands for the daughter of a school teacher," he said in a low voice. "My mother was ill for a very long time before she passed," Abigail replied, looking at the fire. "I learned how to be helpful. It was a better thing to do than to just watch her waste away." She hugged her arms around her body, starting to shake violently again now that she was no longer busy. The small fire was not enough to fight off the deep cold of the mountains. Without saying a word, Elias reached for the heavy wool duster he had taken off. He shook it out and then draped it over her shoulders. The coat was huge on her, covering her in its weight and his scent, but the warmth it provided was instant. "Thank you," she said in a whisper. They sat there quietly for a long time. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the steady chewing of the horse, Brimstone, who was tied up nearby. "The dead circle," Abigail said all of a sudden, feeling a need to break the quiet and get some answers. "My father. He told me they owned every single thing west of the Mississippi that was not bolted down. He called them ghosts. Elias tossed another piece of wood onto the fire. They are not ghosts. They are men of flesh and blood, and they bleed the same as anyone else. But your father was telling the truth about them owning things. He rested his head back on the rock, his eyes mostly closed. The Circle is not a gang of outlaws. It is a business enterprise. They are in charge of gambling, prostitution, opium dens, and land-grabbing operations all the way from St. Louis to San Francisco. They have politicians and judges in their pocket. They get rich off of chaos. Because there is money to be made in chaos. And you were one of them. It was not an accusation, simply a statement of what she knew to be true. I was young and full of anger at the world after the war. They found me because I was a good shot and did not ask questions. They put their brand on me and set me to work collecting on debts. He touched the scar over his heart without thinking. It took me 2 years to figure out I was not some soldier fighting for a cause. I was nothing more than their butcher. He shifted his eyes toward her. When I decided to leave, I did not just ride away. I set fire to their warehouse in Denver. It cost them $50,000. That is why they did this to me. He pointed to the scar that was carved over their brand. The X, it means you are cast out. It means you are to be killed the moment you are seen. Abigail took all of this in. The burden of his past felt heavy in the air that separated them. And my father? Your father was a fool, Elias stated plainly, not trying to protect her feelings. He enjoyed playing cards more than he enjoyed paying his debts. He borrowed money from Blackwood's bank to get into a high-stakes game that a Circle associate was running in Cheyenne. He lost it all. Blackwood is the man who runs things for the Circle in this area. Your father tried to run away. Elias leaned in closer, his eyes looking sharp in the firelight. That brand on his gun was not a mark of pride, Abigail. They carved it into his most prized possession to serve as a reminder that every time he held it, he was their property until the debt was paid. Abigail felt a wave of nausea. The suicide, the auction of her father's things, it all started to make a horrible kind of sense. So Blackwood selling me, that was just a way to get back part of the debt. Partly. But Blackwood is a cruel man. He took pleasure in the thought of breaking Holloway's innocent daughter. The idea entertained him. Abigail looked down at her own hands. They were covered in soot and blood. And what about you? Why did you buy me? $3 and a warrant for some bank robber? Why not just let Blackwood take me and spare yourself? All this trouble? You are already hunting the Circle. Is that not enough for you? Elias remained quiet for so long that she began to think he was not going to answer. He stared into the fire, its flames dancing in his steel-gray eyes. Maybe I just got tired of only chasing after monsters, he said, his voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind outside their shelter. Maybe for once I wanted to stop them from doing the damage in the first place. He looked at her then, and he truly saw her, not as a settled debt, but as a frightened young woman wrapped up in his coat, trying her best to be brave. You should get some sleep, Abigail. We have a hard ride ahead of us tomorrow. Blackwood is not going to give up, not now. That I have made a fool of him and burned his man. Abigail curled up on the corner of the saddle blanket, pulling the duster coat tightly around herself. She watched Elias through half-closed eyes. He did not go to sleep. He sat with his rifle resting across his legs, his eyes fixed on the darkness just beyond the fire's reach. He was a scarred guardian angel, protecting her from the very devils he once called his brothers. In spite of the cold and the danger, for the first time since her father had passed away, Abigail Holloway did not feel completely on her own. The high country of Wyoming showed no mercy for the weak, and it had no pity for the desperate. 2 days after they escaped the burning cabin, the sky turned a dark, bruised gray that was filled with the promise of a storm. The temperature dropped sharply, freezing the sweat on their skin and making the breath of the black stallion, Brimstone, come out in large white clouds of steam. Elias was getting worse. Abigail could feel the intense heat coming off of his body, even through all the layers of wool and leather. He was slumped forward in the saddle in front of her. She had taken the reins from him hours ago when his hands had started to lose their grip. The graze on his ribs, which he had first passed off as just a flesh wound, had turned bad. The bullet must have been dirty, or maybe the uncleaned flannel she used as a bandage was not enough. An infection was taking hold, a slow poison working its way through his system. "We have to stop," Abigail yelled to be heard over the strengthening wind. "Elias, you are burning with fever." "Keep riding," Elias rasped, his voice a faint echo of its usual authority. He tried to shift his weight and grimaced as a sharp pain shot through his side. "Blackwood's got men watching from the ridgeline. They will spot us if we stop." Abigail glanced behind them. The land was a rough landscape of granite and pine trees. It looked empty, except for the swirling snow that was just starting to fall. But she could feel it too, the feeling of being watched. They were being driven somewhere. "There is a pass just ahead," Elias mumbled, using a trembling hand to point toward a narrow gap between the peaks. "Devil's Throat. It leads down to the mining camps. We ought to be able to lose them in there." They kept moving forward. The snow began to come down heavily, like a white sheet that erased the horizon. The wind shrieked through the canyon like a tormented spirit, stinging Abigail's face and making her fingers go numb. By the time they got to the entrance of Devil's Throat, the snow was already up to the horses' ankles. The pass was frighteningly tight. It was a ledge of rock that was barely wide enough for the horse, with a straight drop of 1,000 feet on one side and a sheer rock wall on the other. "Get down," Elias commanded, sliding from the horse's back before Abigail had a chance to argue. His legs gave out from under him and he fell hard into the snow on one knee. "Elias!" Abigail quickly dismounted and hurried to his side. He pushed her away, not out of meanness, but because of the urgency of their situation. "Lead the horse. I will walk behind you. If I fall, you cut the saddlebags free and you ride. Do you understand me?" "I am not going to leave you," Abigail shouted, her frustration flaring up hot in the freezing air. "You bought me, remember? That makes me your responsibility." Elias glanced over at her, his eyes glassy from the fever but lit with the stubborn fire of pride and frustration. He didn't waste breath arguing. He slid his Winchester from its scabbard, planting it in the snow to use as a crutch. They pushed forward. The wind howled, trying its best to throw them right off the cliff. Each step was a struggle. Abigail kept one hand tight on Brimstone's reins, the other reaching back to help keep Elias on his feet. They were about halfway across the pass when the crack of a rifle echoed. The shot didn't come from behind them. It came from high above. A bullet slammed into the rock just inches from Abigail's head, peppering her face with stone chips. She cried out, pressing herself low against the horse's side. "Ambush!" Elias yelled, a surge of adrenaline cutting through his sickness. He dropped to one knee, raising his rifle. "Get down! They're up on the ridge." Far above them, dark figures appeared on the canyon rim. 3 men, just shapes against the dreary gray sky. Blackwood's bunch had figured out their route. They hadn't followed them. They had gotten ahead of them. Another bullet zipped past, smacking the ground near Brimstone's hooves. The big horse reared up in terror. Abigail wrestled with the reins, her boots sliding on the slick, icy rock. If that horse went over the side, they would lose everything: their food, their guns, and their only way out. "Let him go!" Elias shouted. "Abigail, find some cover!" "No!" Abigail wrapped the leather straps around her forearm, pulling the horse toward a small dip in the cliff face. She managed to shove the animal into the shallow alcove, then spun around to find Elias. He was completely out in the open. He was firing back, the heavy thump of his Winchester bouncing off the canyon walls. But he was moving too slow. A bullet caught him in the thigh. It wasn't a fatal hit, but it sent him sprawling to the ground. "Elias!" Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't weigh the odds. She saw the Colt Peacemaker lying in the snow where it must have slipped from Elias's holster. She scrambled out from her cover, lunging for the pistol. "Get back!" Elias yelled, trying to pull himself toward the ledge. Abigail's fingers closed around the heavy revolver. It was cold as ice and felt as heavy as a guilty conscience. She rolled onto her back, craning her neck to look up at the ridge. She couldn't make out the men, just the bright flashes from the muzzles of their guns. "Point it at anything that is not me," Elias had told her. She gripped the gun with both hands, aimed for the figure on the far left, and squeezed the trigger. The kickback nearly snapped her wrists. The shot went wild, hitting the rock a good 10 feet to the man's left, but it gave them a moment's pause. They clearly had not expected the girl to start shooting. "Covering fire," Abigail whispered to herself, more than to Elias. She cocked the hammer. Bang! Another shot. Bang! She fired 3 quick rounds, not aiming for much, just forcing the rifleman on the ridge to take cover. It was just enough time. Elias dragged himself into the little alcove with her and the horse. He was breathing hard, and fresh blood was soaking his pant leg to match the stain on his side. But he was alive. "You're crazy," he gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "You are absolutely out of your mind." "I'm a fast learner," she snapped back, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the big pistol. "Now what?" "We're pinned down. They have the high ground." Elias squinted at the pass ahead of them. It got even narrower, twisting around a tall spire of rock. "The bridge," he muttered. "There's an old rope bridge just around that bend. If we can get across and cut the lines—" "Can you walk?" she asked. "I have to." The next 10 minutes were a complete blur of fear and desperation. With bullets kicking up snow around them, they moved. Abigail fired the last 2 rounds from the Colt to keep the men's heads down, then practically carried Elias around the corner. The bridge was a nightmare, made of rotting wooden planks held up by frayed hemp ropes hanging over a canyon so deep you couldn't even see the bottom through the mist. "Go," Elias ordered, shoving her toward it. "Take the horse. I'll keep them busy here." "Stop trying to get yourself killed," Abigail yelled back at him. She slapped the horse's rear, sending Brimstone stepping nervously onto the swaying bridge. The horse did not like it one bit, but the gunfire behind them was a powerful encouragement. The animal bolted across, making it safely to the other side. "Together," Abigail said, grabbing Elias's arm. They stumbled onto the bridge. The wind swung it back and forth like a cradle. The old wood groaned beneath their weight. When they were halfway across, a bullet cut through one of the guide ropes right next to Abigail's hand. They threw themselves onto the far side just as their pursuers came around the bend behind them. "Cut it!" Elias yelled, collapsing into the snow. Abigail grabbed the knife from his belt, the very same one he had almost used on her that first night. She sawed frantically at the main anchor ropes. The thick hemp was frozen solid and stiff. 3 men were now running toward the bridge from the other side. "Stop her! Shoot the girl!" one shouted. Abigail screamed with effort, throwing all of her weight into the cutting motion. The first rope snapped with a loud crack, like a bullwhip. The bridge dropped and twisted sideways. The men on the other side slid to a stop, afraid to set foot on the now unstable structure. She started hacking at the second rope. "I'll kill you, you little witch!" one of the men yelled, raising his rifle to take aim. Elias, lying flat in the snow, lifted his Winchester one last time. His arm trembled, but then it grew steady. He fired. The man who was aiming his rifle spun around and fell backward right off the cliff. He didn't even yell. He just disappeared into the white emptiness. A moment later, Abigail cut through the second rope. The bridge finally gave way, swinging down and smashing into the far canyon wall with a deafening crash. They were safe. The gap between them was now impossible to cross. Abigail dropped the knife and fell to her knees, fighting to catch her breath. She looked over at Elias. He had let go of the rifle and was lying on his back, just staring up at the snow falling from the sky. His eyes were closing. "Elias," she crawled over to him, shaking his shoulders. "Elias, wake up!" He groaned, his head rolling to one side. "Tired, Abby. Just so tired." "No sleeping," she ordered, tears freezing on her face. "You don't get to sleep now." She somehow managed to get him back onto the horse. It took every bit of strength she had, using a trick she had seen farmers use to lift heavy sacks of grain. She tied his hands to the saddle horn to keep him from falling off. Then she took the reins and just started walking, leading them blindly into the blizzard. She had no idea where they were going. All she knew was that if they stopped moving, the cold or the fever would finish the job that the dead circle had started. For Elias Graham, memory became a strange and tricky thing. For 2 whole days, it only came to him in feverish dreams. He remembered the sharp smell of black powder from the war. He remembered the face of the very first man he had ever killed. He remembered the cold, empty eyes of the circle's leader back in St. Louis. And then he remembered gentle hands and a voice that sang old hymns in a low, shaky tone. He could taste melted snow being trickled over his cracked lips. When he finally opened his eyes for good, the world was completely silent. He was lying on a straw mattress in a small room that smelled of sawdust and dried herbs. Sunlight, that bright and piercing kind of winter sun, was pouring through a little window. He tried to sit up and immediately wished he had not. Pain shot through his side and his leg, but it was a dull throb, not the burning fire of an infection. Looked down at himself. He was dressed in clean long johns. His wounds had been stitched up and covered with some kind of paste that smelled like a strong root. "You're awake." Elias turned his head. Abigail was sitting in a rocking chair by the wood stove with a shotgun resting across her lap. She looked completely different. The scared girl in the cheap wedding dress was long gone. Now she wore a pair of men's trousers that were too big for her, held up with suspenders and a thick wool shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid. Her face looked thinner, her cheekbones sharper, and she had a dark bruise on her jaw, but her eyes were steady and clear. "Where are we?" Elias asked, his voice raspy. "Silver Hollow," she replied, getting up to pour him a cup of coffee. "It's a small mining camp about 20 miles north of the pass. You were out for 3 days." Elias accepted the cup, his hands still a little unsteady. "How did we get here?" "I walked," she said, plain and simple. "A prospector found us up on the trail. An old man named Jeb. He helped me bring you in. He said he used to be a medic in the army. He's the one who stitched you up." Elias looked around the little cabin. "We are not safe here. Blackwood has eyes and ears in every one of these camps." "I know," Abigail said. She walked over to the window, looking out through a crack in the boards. "That is why we are leaving tonight. But we had to wait for your fever to break first." Elias just watched her. Something fundamental had changed between them. She had saved his life. The debt he thought she owed, if it ever really existed, was now paid back 10 times over. "Abigail," he said, his voice soft. She turned to face him. "You should leave me here," he told her. "Take the horse. Head north to Montana. Change your name. You can start a new life." Abigail's face hardened. She walked right over to the bed and stood over him. "You paid $3 for me, Elias Graham. And that little note said, 'Until death. You do not look dead to me yet.'" She sat on the edge of the bed, her voice getting a little softer. "Besides, I found something in your coat pocket when I was cleaning your clothes." "A map?" Elias went still. "That map is not for you. It marks a bank in Cheyenne and a safe deposit box number," she went on, ignoring his protest. "That is what you were going to get, wasn't it, before you came to get me? You were on your way to get the evidence you need to destroy the circle." Elias let out a long, defeated sigh. "It's a ledger. Thomas Blackwood, the brother I informed on, he kept a detailed book. It has names, bribes, and the locations of all their hideouts. I have the key. The book is in that bank. If I can get that ledger to the U.S. Marshal in Laramie, the dead circle is finished." "Then that is where we are going," Abigail declared. That is just asking to get killed. To get to Cheyenne, we have to ride back down this mountain right past Purgatory Creek. So we make our stand there, she said. Elias looked over at her, and for the first time in 10 long years, he felt a spark of something that felt an awful lot like hope. He reached out, his rough hand covering hers. "All right then," he said, his voice raspy. "We fight." The plan was as simple as a desert sunrise, which meant it was almost guaranteed to go wrong. They slipped out of Silver Hollow under a sky with no moon. Elias was weak, but he could ride. Abigail sat behind him, that big shotgun resting in her arms. They did not head for Cheyenne. They rode straight for Purgatory Creek. "It is the very last place they will look for us," Elias had argued. "They figure we are running north. We are going to go right back into the lion's den, get ourselves some fresh horses from the livery, and follow the train tracks east. It will shave 3 whole days off our journey." It was a gutsy move. They reached the edge of town around 3 in the morning. The whole place was quiet. Even the saloon was finally dark. They made it to the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and horses. Elias slid off his horse, the movement full of pain as he went to deal with the stable boy sleeping up in the loft. "Get 2 good mounts," Elias whispered to Abigail. "Saddle 'em up quick. I will keep an eye on the door." Abigail got to work, her hands now skilled with leather straps and buckles. She picked out a strong mare and a tough-looking gelding. She was pulling the cinch tight on the mare when the heavy stable doors slammed shut behind them. Lanterns flared to life up in the rafters, casting long, dancing shadows. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively going for his pistol, but the sound of a dozen hammers being cocked all at once froze him solid. "Well now," a voice like dripping poison echoed from the shadows. "Look what the cat dragged in. The runaway hunter." Cyrus Blackwood stepped out from a stall, a fancy pearl-handled revolver in his hand. He had 10 men with him, deputies, hired guns, and that snake Beauregard in his velvet suit. They had been lying in wait. "You did not honestly think we would lose your trail, did you?" Blackwood sneered. "We knew where you were the second you bought that penicillin from the dock in Silver Hollow. A fella like you does not get better with just prayer." Elias stood up as straight as he could, trying to shield Abigail with his body. "Let her go, Cyrus. This has nothing to do with her anymore. You want me? You want that ledger? It is all yours." "Oh, I know it is mine," Blackwood chuckled. "But I believe I will keep the girl, too. After all, I paid a good price for her at the auction, and now she is damaged property. Riding with a traitor like you, well, that requires a bit of punishment." "Run, Abigail," Elias breathed, his hand slowly creeping toward his gun. "No," she whispered right back. "I said run." Elias drew his weapon. It was all a flash of desperate speed. Elias fanned the hammer on his peacemaker, and 2 men dropped before they knew what hit them. The stable exploded in a roar of gunfire, but there were just too many of them. A bullet tore through Elias's shoulder, spinning him like a top. Another one found his leg, the good one. He collapsed to the ground. "Do not kill him," Blackwood bellowed. "I want him alive. I plan to peel the skin from his bones real slow." His men swarmed Elias, kicking the gun out of his hand and beating him with the butts of their rifles. Abigail brought the shotgun up to her shoulder, but before she could squeeze the trigger, Beauregard snatched the barrel, wrenched it from her hands, and smacked her hard across the face. She tumbled into the straw, her head spinning. The last thing she saw clearly was them dragging Elias away. His face was a mess of blood, but his eyes were locked right on hers. "Abigail," he choked out. Blackwood strolled over to Abigail. He grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked her to her knees. He looked her over with a nasty sneer. "Lock her in the sheriff's cell," Blackwood told his men. "I will take care of her after I'm finished with Mr. Graham." He leaned in close. "I want her to hear every last scream." As they hauled Abigail off, she did not scream. She did not shed a single tear. She could taste hot, metallic blood in her mouth. She watched them drag Elias toward the saloon's basement, their torture room. They figured they had won. They thought she was just some poor, helpless girl. But as the iron cell door clanged shut, Abigail Halloway sat on the cold cot and felt along the waistband of her pants. Her fingers found the cold steel of the little pocket knife Elias had given her to cut the bridge ropes. They had not bothered to search her properly. She flicked the blade open. It was a small thing, barely 2 inches long, but it was more than enough to pick an old lock, and Elias Graham was not going to die tonight. Not if the virgin bride had anything to say about it. The lock on that jail cell was old and rusty. It was no match for a determined woman. With a soft, satisfying click, the lock gave way. She did not run for the hills. She ran straight toward the fire. With a bottle of strong moonshine and a box of matches she had lifted, Abigail set the livery stable on fire. As folks started yelling and Blackwood's men ran to save the horses, she slipped right into the saloon basement. Elias was hanging by his wrists, bloody and beaten, but still conscious. Blackwood stood in front of him, holding a long knife. "Last chance, Graham. Where is the key to that deposit box?" "Behind you," Elias rasped. Blackwood spun around, and there was Abigail, holding a double-barreled shotgun she had grabbed from the sheriff's office. She did not waste a second. She pulled the trigger. The blast did not hit Blackwood. It shattered the main support beam right next to him, and a huge part of the ceiling came crashing down. In all the smoke and confusion, Abigail sliced the ropes holding Elias. He collapsed against her, a heavy, broken weight. But he was alive. "You came back," he whispered, his voice a mix of shock and wonder. "I told you," she grunted, pushing a Colt pistol into his hand. "We fight." They staggered out of the burning saloon and into the street. Blackwood, bleeding from a dozen cuts, stumbled out right behind them, raising that fancy pearl-handled revolver of his. "I bought you!" Blackwood shrieked at Abigail, his voice cracking. "You belong to me!" Elias Graham pulled himself up straight. He looked at the woman who had just saved his life. She was not a victim. And she was not just a virgin bride. She was a warrior who had been forged in fire. He raised his pistol. "She paid her own debt," Elias growled. A single shot rang out. Cyrus Blackwood fell face down in the dirt of Purgatory Creek. As the sun came up over the mountains, it painted the broken town in shades of gold. The vicious circle was finally broken. Elias and Abigail stood there in the middle of all the destruction, bruised and bleeding, but they were free. He did not get down on one knee this time. He just took her hand in his. "Best $3 I ever spent," he said quietly. Abigail managed a small smile, wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. "Just shut up and kiss me, cowboy." And right there, in the middle of that dusty street, he did. And that, my friends, is the legend of the $3 bride. What began as a cruel auction in a dirty saloon turned into one of the greatest stories of revenge and love the West has ever known. Abigail Halloway proved that you can put a price on a person, but you can never, ever own their spirit. And Elias Graham learned that sometimes the only way to save your own soul is to hand it over to someone else for safekeeping. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, go on and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets us bring y'all more wild tales from the old frontier. What would you have done if you were in Abigail's boots? Tell me all about it in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss another story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.